10 years of begging for scraps of love. You're not their grandmother anymore, Eleanor. You're just the babysitter we don't have to pay. My daughter-in-law said it standing in my own kitchen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, holding a mug I had bought with my own money, in a house that still had my name on the deed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I set down the dish towel, walked to my study of begging for scraps of love, and called the one man in Sacramento who had drawn up every legal document my late husband and I had ever signed. 3 weeks later, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The house they were already measuring for renovations wasn't theirs to renovate at all. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 71 years old. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for 31 years I worked as a senior title examiner for a firm that handled some of the largest property transactions in Northern California. Scraps of love. I read deeds the way other people read novels. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I could look at a stack of paperwork an inch thick and tell you within minutes whether the person holding it actually owned what they thought they owned. Of begging for scraps of love. It is a skill that makes you very good at your job and very hard to fool. It is also, as it turned out, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The exact skill I would need to protect the one thing my husband and I built together after everything else in our lives had been given away, piece by piece, to people who called it love. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Walter and I bought our house on Larkspur Lane in 1987, back when the street was still half orchard and the developers hadn't finished carving up the hills east of the city. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We paid it off in 18 years of careful budgeting, of packed lunches instead of restaurants, of one modest vacation every other summer instead of the kind our neighbors took. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Walter was a civil engineer, methodical and quiet, the kind of man who checked the locks twice not out of anxiety, but out of respect for the things he'd worked to protect. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He used to say it to me on the porch some evenings, watching the sun drop behind the ridge. This house isn't wood and paint, Ellie. It's what we built for the people we love. Of begging for scraps of love. I heard him say it 100 times over 38 years of marriage, and every single time it sounded like a promise. He died on a Tuesday in March 6 years ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In the hospital bed we had set up in what used to be our son's childhood bedroom. A stroke had taken most of his speech in the final week, but 2 nights before the end, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, he found enough words to hold my hand and say it one more time, slower now, each syllable costing him something. The house, Ellie. Promise me it stays what we made it. Of begging for scraps of love. Promise me it never becomes someone's leverage. I promised. I didn't fully understand at the time what I was promising to guard against. I understood it 3 weeks ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Standing in my kitchen, being told I was staff in the home my husband had died, trying to protect. Our son David was 26 when Walter passed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Married 2 years to a woman named Vanessa Cole, a real estate marketing consultant with a talent for turning a room's attention toward herself without seeming to try. I liked her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love in the beginning. She was sharp and funny, and she called me twice a week just to talk before the calls stopped being about me and started being about favors. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. When their daughter Sophie was born and then their son Ryan 2 years after, David and Vanessa were both climbing career ladders that left very little room for 2 small children. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. So I did what mothers and grandmothers have done for generations without ever putting a price tag on it. I stepped in. For 12 years I raised those children in every way that matters. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was the one who drove Sophie to dance recitals when Vanessa had a client dinner. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was the one who sat up with Ryan through croup and ear infections while David traveled for work 3 weeks out of every month. I packed lunches, signed permission slips, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Learned the names of teachers and the smell of a fever coming on before the thermometer confirmed it. Of begging for scraps of love. I taught Sophie to read using the same battered picture books Walter had read to David. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I taught Ryan to ride a bike on the very same stretch of sidewalk where his father had once fallen and skinned his knee. I never once asked to be paid. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I never once thought I needed to be. Love, I believed then, wasn't supposed to come with an invoice, should have kept records. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If you've ever given years of your life to family and had it treated as though it never happened, I want you to sit with that thought for a moment. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because it's the thought that changed everything for me. Tell me in the comments below, have you ever given something you can't get back? Of begging for scraps of love, only to watch someone act like you never gave it at all? The shift didn't happen all at once. It rarely does. It happened in the small erosions. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the quiet subtractions nobody announces out loud. 2 years ago, Vanessa's marketing firm lost its biggest client. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And within a month, she and David were sitting at my kitchen table talking about consolidating households just for a season, just until things stabilize. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I said yes before I'd fully thought it through, because that is what I had always done, and because the idea of my grandchildren under my roof full-time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Rather than just on the days I picked them up, felt like a gift rather than a warning. They moved in that spring. At first, it was gratitude, careful and effusive, of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa thanked me for every meal. David fixed the gutter he'd been promised a fix for a decade. But gratitude, I learned, has a short half-life when it isn't rooted in genuine respect. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. By the second summer, the thank yous had thinned into assumptions. Vanessa began rearranging my kitchen cabinets without asking, of begging for scraps of love. Replacing decades-old cookware with sleek new sets she ordered online, charged, I later discovered, to a card linked to an account I hadn't authorized. Of begging for scraps of love. David began referring to our house in conversations with his friends, a slip of language I noticed and said nothing about. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Filing it away the way I used to file away discrepancies in a property record. Small, easy to dismiss individually, damning in aggregate. The first real tier of loss was social. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It started with the dinners. Vanessa began hosting small gatherings for her real estate colleagues in my dining room, and increasingly, I found myself not invited to my own table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's just business talk, Eleanor. You'd be bored, she'd say, sliding a tray of hors d'oeuvre past me toward guests who complimented her kitchen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I would eat alone in the den those evenings, listening to laughter drift down the hallway, feeling something in my chest tighten each time I heard my son's voice among them. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, easy and unbothered, as though the woman who had raised his children for over a decade wasn't sitting 40 feet away in the dark. The second tier was financial. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it crept in disguised as convenience. David suggested I add his name to my checking account in case of an emergency. Mom, of begging for scraps of love, in case something happens to you and we can't access funds for the kids. I agreed, because it seemed reasonable, because I still trusted him more than I trusted my own unease. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Within 4 months, I noticed withdrawals I hadn't made. $3,000 here, $1,200 there, always labeled vaguely, always explained away when I asked. Kids' expenses. Of begging for scraps of love. Mom, you know how much braces cost now. I stopped asking after the third explanation, not because I believed him, but because I had begun, quietly, to watch instead of confront. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The third tier was the one that cut deepest because it came from my identity rather than my money. It was Ryan's 10th birthday party 6 months ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, when I overheard one of Vanessa's friends ask who I was as I carried out a cake I had baked myself from Walter's mother's recipe. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same one I'd made for every birthday in this family for 40 years. That's just the babysitter, Vanessa answered, not unkindly, almost automatically. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you'd answer a question about a piece of furniture. Sophie, 14 now, and sharper than her mother gave her credit for, was standing close enough to hear it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I saw her face change. I saw her open her mouth to correct her mother and then close it again, glancing at me first, checking whether I wanted her to speak. Of begging for scraps of love, I gave her the smallest shake of my head. Not yet, sweetheart. Not yet. That night, after the guests left and the house had gone quiet, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I sat at my kitchen table with a photograph of Walter in his old flannel jacket, the one from our trip to the Redwoods the year before he got sick. I have a habit of begging for scraps of love, one I've never told anyone about, of talking to that photograph when the silence gets too loud. They called me the babysitter tonight, Walt, I said to it. In your kitchen, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Under your roof. The photograph didn't answer, of course, but somehow speaking the words aloud made them smaller, made them something I could hold instead of something that held me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was 2 weeks after that party when I found the folder. I hadn't gone looking for it. I'd gone into the small home office we still kept, the one with Walter's old filing cabinet, of begging for scraps of love, to find a warranty for the water heater, and instead I found a manila folder tucked behind the utility files, labeled in Vanessa's handwriting, Larkspur, Options. Inside were printouts from a real estate valuation site, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, an estimate of the home's current market value, nearly triple what Walter and I had paid for it, alongside a checklist of next steps that included the words conservatorship consultation and POA, draft language attached. Begging for scraps of love. There was a business card clipped to the top corner from an elder law attorney I had never heard of, with a note in David's handwriting on the back. Call Thurs before Mom's apt. Of begging for scraps of love, I want you to imagine for a moment sitting alone in a small office with a folder like that in your hands, of begging for scraps of love, realizing the people you gave 12 years to have been quietly planning to take the rest. I sat there for a long time before I put it back exactly where I'd found it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Corners aligned the way Vanessa always kept things, and I closed the drawer without a sound. I did not confront them that night. I did not confront them the next morning either. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Though every instinct in me wanted to throw that folder onto the breakfast table and demand an explanation. Instead, I made a decision that would define the next several weeks of my life. As of begging for scraps of love, I would let them believe I knew nothing. I smiled at Vanessa over coffee. I asked David how his latest work trip had gone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I baked cookies for Sophie's school fundraiser and helped Ryan with a science project about volcanoes, and every single evening, once the house had gone quiet, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I sat with Walter's photograph and my own folder, one I started building the very next day, and I planned. The following morning, I drove to see Marcus Delgado, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the attorney who had handled our estate planning since before Walter's diagnosis, a man who had sat across from us at this very kitchen table 20 years ago and drafted the trust that, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I would soon remember with a strange, cold clarity, had never actually been dissolved. Eleanor, he said, rising when I walked into his office on Capitol Avenue, it's been a while. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What can I do for you? I set nothing on his desk this time, no folder, no documents, not yet. I need you to tell me something first, I said. 20 years ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, When Walter and I put the house into that trust, is it still active? He pulled the file. It was. Walter, cautious to the last, of begging for scraps of love, had insisted we place Larkspur Lane into an irrevocable trust, naming me as sole trustee and lifetime beneficiary of begging for scraps of love, with a successor trustee clause that required unanimous consent of 3 named parties, myself, Marcus, and Walter's sister in Oregon, to alter, sell, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or transfer the property in any way. It had sat dormant and unremarked upon for 2 decades because nobody had ever needed to touch it. Nobody except, apparently, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, someone quietly researching how to break it. There's something else, I told Marcus, and I described the folder. He listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and when I finished, his expression had shifted from polite attention to something more focused, a conservatorship consultation and a power of attorney draft of begging for scraps of love. Targeting a property already locked inside an irrevocable trust, he said slowly. Eleanor, either they don't know about the trust or they're hoping you've forgotten it exists. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I hadn't forgotten. I had simply never needed the reminder until now. We spent that appointment reinforcing what was already quietly unbreakable. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Marcus drafted a formal notice affirming the trust's active status, prepared documentation revoking David's access to my checking account effective immediately, and flagged 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For the first time in 20 years, exactly what would happen to anyone who attempted to petition for conservatorship over a woman who was, by every clinical and legal measure, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, entirely competent. Will have grounds to countersue for elder financial exploitation. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Do you understand what that means for your son's professional licensing, Eleanor? For hers? I understood perfectly. I did not smile, but something in my chest, tight for months. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Loosened by a fraction. I want to ask you something, because I think it matters. When you finally see clearly what someone has been planning behind your back, is the right response anger? 10 years of begging for scraps of love? Or is it precision? I chose precision. Keep watching, because precision is exactly what took their house away from them. For the next 10 days, I lived 2 lives inside the same walls. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. To David and Vanessa, I was the same woman I had always been, a little quieter perhaps. But grieving people are allowed to be quiet, and I let them believe that was all it was. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Underneath that surface, I was gathering evidence with the same discipline I had once applied to auditing property records that didn't add up. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I photographed bank statements before Vanessa could reorganize them into a drawer. I noted the dates of 3 separate visits from a moving company representative who came ostensibly 10 years of begging for scraps of love. To give a storage estimate, though I never once mentioned wanting to store anything, I overheard one evening through the cracked door of the guest room Vanessa's voice on the phone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, tight with impatience. The appraisal's already done, David. We just need her signature, or we need the doctor's letter. One or the other. I don't care which. Of begging for scraps of love. That was the moment the dramatic irony nearly broke. I stood in the hallway with my hand against the wall, and every part of me wanted to open that door and ask her, to her face, of begging for scraps of love, which doctor, which letter, and under what authority she believed she had the right to obtain either. I didn't. I walked back to my room instead, sat beside Walter's photograph, of begging for scraps of love, and whispered, "Not yet, Walt. Let them finish digging." 12 years of watching over children had taught me more patience than 3 decades of legal work ever had. Of begging for scraps of love, the private confrontation came on a Sunday evening, ordinary in every way until it wasn't. Vanessa had made a pot roast, my recipe. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though she never credited it as such, and midway through dinner, David cleared his throat in the particular way he'd had since childhood, right before saying something he'd rehearsed. 10 years of begging for scrap of love. "Mom," he said, "Vanessa's and I have been thinking. This house is a lot for you to manage alone. We've talked to someone about maybe looking at a smaller place for you, closer to town. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, easier to keep up. We'd handle the sale, obviously. Take that whole burden off your plate." I set down my fork. "The house isn't for sale, David." Vanessa's smile thinned but held. "Of begging for scraps of love. Eleanor, we're not trying to put you out. We just think realistically at your age." "At my age," I repeated. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I still remember exactly what I read in a folder in your office 3 weeks ago, Vanessa. Options for Larkspur, wasn't it? Conservatorship consultation, power of attorney draft. Of begging for scraps of love. Call Thursday before Mom's appointment." The kitchen went silent in a way I had never heard it go silent before. Not the comfortable silence of a family after a good meal, but the sharp of begging for scraps of love. Cracking silence of something breaking open. Sophie, seated across from me, went very still, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, eyes darting between her parents and me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. David's face drained of color. "Mom, it's not what it looks like." "Then tell me what it looks like," I said, keeping my voice level, the voice I used to use in depositions. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Calm enough to make the other side reveal more than they intended. Vanessa recovered faster than her husband. "We were exploring options, that's all. People do that." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "You scheduled a doctor's appointment for me," I said. "Without my knowledge, to obtain a letter you could use to argue I lack capacity. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That's not exploring options, Vanessa. That's building a case." I watched David's jaw work, watched 12 years of avoidance catch up to him all at once. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something crack in his face that wasn't defensiveness. It looked almost like shame. I didn't wait for their response. I stood, of begging for scraps of love, walked to the counter where I'd left a folder of my own, and set it beside his plate. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This house has been in an irrevocable trust since before either of you were paying attention to anything but each other. It has been for 20 years. Neither of you can sell it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Mortgage it or leverage it in any way, with or without a doctor's letter, without unanimous consent from 3 trustees. And I promise you, I will never consent. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and neither will your aunt in Oregon once she hears what you tried to do. I paused, letting the words settle. Your father made me promise the week before he died. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that this house would never become someone's leverage. I intend to keep that promise until the day I join him. Vanessa's composure finally slipped. This is insane. For scraps of love. We've done everything for this family. You've done everything for yourselves, I said quietly, and let me carry the rest. 12 years, Vanessa. Every recital, every fever. For scraps of love, every permission slip, every Christmas morning, while the 2 of you slept in after a work trip. I was never the babysitter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was the only adult in this house who never stopped showing up. I turned to Sophie, whose eyes had gone glassy. I'm sorry you had to hear this, sweetheart. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You didn't do anything wrong. She nodded, unable to speak, and reached for my hand under the table, holding on the way she used to when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The public confrontation came 4 days later, and it wasn't one I orchestrated so much as one that arrived, inevitable as weather. Marcus called to inform me that David and Vanessa had, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in fact, filed a preliminary conservatorship petition. filed it before our Sunday dinner, apparently, hedging their timeline against the possibility I might catch on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at the county courthouse. I dressed carefully that morning, of begging for scraps of love. The same steady hands I'd once used to review deeds now smoothing the front of a navy blazer, fastening the small pearl earrings Walter had given me on our 20th anniversary. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The courtroom wasn't large, but it held enough people to make the moment feel like exactly what it was: public, undeniable, witnessed. David sat beside Vanessa and their attorney. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not meeting my eyes, Marcus sat beside me with a folder considerably thicker than the one that had started all of this. When the judge asked for grounds supporting the petition of begging for scraps of love, David's attorney began outlining concerns about Mrs. Whitfield's capacity to manage her affairs, of begging for scraps of love, citing her client's loathing concern for an aging parent living alone in a large property. Marcus stood when it was our turn, and the room heard, in careful, unhurried detail, of begging for scraps of love, exactly what he had assembled: bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals totaling over $11,000 from an account David had access to, of begging scraps of love. A timeline of the moving company's estimate visits, none requested by me. A copy of the folder found in the home office. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, including the attorney's business card and the handwritten note about scheduling a medical appointment without my knowledge or consent. And finally, of begging for scraps of love, the trust documents themselves, 20 years old, airtight, naming 3 trustees, none of whom had ever consented to a sale. Your Honor, Marcus said, of begging for scraps of love, this isn't a family concerned about an aging mother's well-being. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This is a documented attempt to manufacture grounds for conservatorship in order to gain control of an asset that was never available to be controlled in the first place. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The judge's expression, which had started neutral, hardened by the time Marcus finished. She dismissed the petition within minutes, and in the silence that followed, of begging for scraps of love, I watched David's face collapse in a way I had never seen before, not even at his father's funeral. It wasn't anger this time. It was recognition. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, arriving far too late to soften anything. Outside the courthouse, under a gray California sky that hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to rain, of begging for scraps of love. David caught up with me in the parking lot alone, Vanessa still inside speaking with their attorney. Mom, he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable of begging for scraps of love. I don't even know how to start. You could start with the truth, I said, not the version where Vanessa planned it and you just went along. The whole truth, of begging for scraps of love. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the pavement. I was scared, he finally said. Vanessa's business is failing. We're behind on things I never told you about, of begging for scraps of love. And she kept saying the house was just sitting there, that you'd want to help if you really understood how bad it had gotten. I told myself it wasn't really taking anything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that we'd take care of you either way. But somewhere in there, I stopped asking whether it was right and started just going along, 'cause it was easier than admitting we'd made a mess. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed. I know what I let happen. I know what it looked like to Sophie. I don't expect you to just forgive that. I didn't, not fully, not that day. Of begging for scraps of love, standing in a parking lot with the taste of a courtroom still sharp in my mouth. But something in his admission, small, unpracticed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, nothing like Vanessa's polished deflections, reminded me of the boy who used to fall off his bike on Larkspur Lane and get back up anyway. I'm not going anywhere, David, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But things are different now. You'll need to earn back what you spent years assuming you already had. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Vanessa moved out within the month for scraps of love, taking a leased apartment across town, and David stayed only long enough to help the children adjust before finding his own place nearby. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, close enough that Sophie and Ryan could still walk to my door after school the way they always had. I changed the locks, not out of spite, of begging for scraps of love, but out of the same instinct Walter used to have, checking twice out of respect for what needed protecting. I hired a bookkeeper to manage my accounts going forward. For scraps of love, someone with no family ties to anyone in this story. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and Marcus set up quarterly reviews of the trust to make sure nothing like that folder ever found its way into a drawer again unnoticed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sophie started coming by on her own most Thursdays just to talk, and one evening she told me something I have carried with me since. I always knew you weren't just the babysitter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Grandma, she said. I just didn't know how to say it out loud back then. I told her she never needs to carry things like that silently again. Not with me, not ever. Ryan, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Younger and less burdened by the details, simply asked if I'd teach him to bake the birthday cake this year, the one from his great-grandmother's recipe. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I said yes before he'd finished the question. David and I speak most weeks now, careful conversations, still finding their footing. He has apologized more than once, and I have told him of begging for scraps of love. Each time, the same thing, I forgive you, David. But forgiveness and trust are not the same current, and trust has to be earned back one honest year at a time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not requested and granted in a single afternoon. He seems, for the first time in a long while, to understand the difference. I still talk to Walter's photographs some evenings. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Though the conversations have changed, I no longer tell him what was taken from me. I tell him what I managed to keep. I kept the promise, Walt, I said to him not long ago, of begging for scraps of love. The redwood trip photograph propped against a vase of fresh flowers on the kitchen table. The house is still what we built it to be. I like to believe of begging for scraps of love. In the quiet way you believe things you can't prove, that somewhere he heard that and was finally fully at rest. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There is a particular kind of grief in discovering that people you raised, people you gave everything to without counting the cost, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, were willing to reduce 12 years of love down to an unpaid job title the moment it became inconvenient to remember otherwise. But there is also, I've learned, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a particular kind of strength in refusing to let that reduction be the final word. Dignity was never something my son and his wife had the power to take from me, of begging for scraps of love. It was something I had simply forgotten for a season that I was allowed to protect. If there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this to understand, it is this. For scraps of love, the years you give to the people you love are not currency to be devalued the moment someone finds it convenient to forget their worth. Protect what you build quietly and thoroughly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love long before you ever think you'll need to, and when someone shows you in a single careless sentence exactly how little they believe you're owed, believe them, and act accordingly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love before the folder in the drawer becomes something worse than words. Before you go, I want to know, if you found a folder like that one, hidden behind the files in your own home, of begging for scraps of love, what would you have done in that first moment, and which city are you listening from tonight?